Hi everyone, Jessica Heredia and Katie Machado here with Coldwell Banker, and I'm very proud to present a good friend of ours, a seasoned attorney, Steve Boyers, who's here to talk to us about installment sales. So Steve, please share with us, what exactly is an installment sale?
Well, thank you, Jessica. The question is probably the easiest one I'll get. Actually, technically speaking, an installment sale is simply a sale that really isn't completed in 1 year, meaning that the funds used to purchase the property are not completely delivered to the seller in 1 year, 1 calendar year. So if you had an escrow that closed in this year, 2023, and part of the purchase price was paid in 2024, it would be an installment sale. And in terms of what I like to structure, we actually structure that proration over many years to reduce the amount of capital gains tax involved at any point in time.
Well, that leads into my question, Steve. So what is the advantage of installment sale for both a seller and a buyer in today's market?
Probably the most significant question, I think, on the table. There are advantages to both the buyer and the seller. Let's start with the seller first. Seller gets a reduction in the capital gains tax, which is a significant tax. In this area, we're often dealing with homes with accumulated equity in the millions of dollars. If you have a home that has a $3 million equity in it, that home will probably have a capital gains tax of over $1 million. That is money that doesn't go to the seller. It goes to the state of California and the federal government. If we do an installment sale, we can reduce and mitigate that capital gains tax, and reducing it to practically nothing in the first few years of that transaction. For the seller, there's an additional advantage. That equity in the home is used to purchase the home by the buyer. So essentially, the seller loans the money, the equity in his home, to the buyer. We cut out the bank, which is the middleman, and we usually do it at a below market interest rate. So if you go to a bank and get a loan on that $3 million you would need it to close the escrow, you'd be looking at $210,000 in interest, maybe another several thousand dollars in points. You've got the process of going through a bank loan. You may not qualify. So it's a long and expensive process. When we do an installment sale, because there is no bank, the seller winds up loaning the equity to the buyer, and we can usually do it at an interest rate that's substantially less, say around 5% versus 7%. What that really does is also to enable the seller to more easily sell. I think we increase the pool of available buyers by making more people able to qualify. For the buyer, the advantage is really relatively simple. As opposed to paying 7% and paying maybe an appraisal fee and paying points and going through a bank loan, what happens is you work with the seller, and the seller gives you a rate, because the seller is looking how much of an income can we generate. So 5% on that same $3 million is $150,000 a year in interest. In many cases, that's what the buyer is willing to pay, can't afford to pay, and the seller says, well, that's an income that I can use. I don't need to buy another house. I want to have the money to travel. I may have lifestyle changes. I may have anticipated medical payments. Whatever you want, all of a sudden, in addition to whatever else the seller has, the seller now has a substantial, and I should say safe income, because just as if a bank were to take a first trust deed, the seller gets a first trust deed back from the buyer. So should there be a problem, no worse off than the bank.
Great, thanks for explaining that, Steve. Now, can you just give us a quick run through of an example? Because a conversation that Katie and I are having often today is, we have clients that are property rich and cash poor. They've been in the home for several years. They have a very low interest rate that they don't want to give up, but they need to make a move. Let's just say they're looking to downsize because they need to move from a 2-story home to a single story, but they have a significant amount of capital gains. What would it look like for, let's just say, a $3 million sale? What is a typical down payment for a buyer? Is it a typically 30-year loan? Walk us through what an ideal typical structure would look like.
One of the advantages of the installment sale is in the way which I structure them, is that we're always focused on reducing the amount of the capital gains tax that's paid. So instead of even the traditional 20% down payment, or in this market, sometimes in order to close out the sale, a realtor will often push for a higher down payment. I'm actually going the other direction. I'd like to, with a $3 million equity, the home is probably worth more than $3 million. And so 10% or $300,000 would be enough for me to cover the closing costs, pay the brokerage commission, and any other fees associated with it. And the reason I would do that is because every dollar I can defer into the future in terms of receipt of income by the seller is less tax that they would pay. And the tax structure is such that you want to keep the capital gains tax in the range of the 15% bracket versus, say, a 30% for the capital gains. In the state of California, there is, strictly speaking, no capital gains tax, but you have an income tax, and so it just graduates your income tax. So between the state and federal, you're easily up over 32%. You could be even higher than that. So for the terms of the initial structuring, it is a structure in which we really need to talk to the seller and see what we can do to accommodate his needs. How much does he need? What does he want the money for? And then we wrap it up in terms of the amortization period, the interest rate, and the down payment. Those are the three variables which we then work with specifically a given client to see what makes sense for them. And also, the second half is negotiation with the buyer. Right. At some point, when you bring a buyer to the table, the buyer is going to say, well, these are my requirements, and these are what I need to have. That becomes a negotiation. At the end of the day, you hope that you've got a win-win situation that you've created.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Steve.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you. By the way, I should say that I'm unaware of very many realtors who are involved in doing installment sales. It's something that is in the Internal Revenue Code. It's been there for a long time. It was very popular back in late 70s, early 80s when interest rates were running around 18%. But in today's market, particularly while the interest rates aren't as high as they were back then, 8% is a lot of money because the homes have appreciated in value significantly. So we're talking about 8% on millions of dollars in this area on almost any transaction. Right. Seems to me that if I were a buyer or a seller, I'd want to be talking to a realtor who's in a position to discuss all these facets as well as the other aspects of buying and selling a home.
Thank you. And that's why we turn to you, the professional, in handling transactions like this, and like to work with professionals.
It's my pleasure to work with people on the cutting edge all the time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.